Welcome, boys and girls. Costin here with a discussion about Thorek Ironbrow, the boomer of the Dwarf Legendary Lords, and probably the one Legendary Lord of the Dwarves that feels very outdated in terms of his campaign. To be sure, Belegar does have campaign issues with regards to how that upkeep works until you get Caracade Peaks and then gaining an enormous level of power once you do take Caracade Peaks. But Thorek, in terms of his lore design, he worked pretty well before the Dwarf rework, or rather before Warhammer 3, and then he just really started falling apart. You see, Thorek's campaign focus is on traditional units, so think of Quarrelers, think of Grudge Throwers, think of Bolt Throwers. Anyone, by the way, who's focusing on Bolt Throwers, if they're a Dwarf, is already a very questionable campaign. You don't need to use Bolt Throwers unless you're dealing with heavy enemy artillery, and chances are that your Grudge Throwers are going to be able to tackle that to begin with. But the issue with the Quarreler and Grudge Thrower army is that while it does work in a campaign, in more ways than one, it also carries with it a bunch of vulnerabilities. In particular, when things start going to hell and back in a campaign situation like this. Yes, mistakes were made over here, though I was not necessarily aiming for optimization in terms of securing my starting position. In fact, that's kind of the one issue that we got to talk about Thorek. See, if we look at a climate situation, one of the advantages, quote-unquote advantages, is that he has jungle climate as suitable. But the last thing that you want to do when you're playing a Thorek campaign is actually engage in the jungle. You may wish to do so in order to, one way or another, deal with Warzag, but funnily enough, you might just be benefiting a lot by allying Warzag in this campaign. And that is not a joke, by the way. It's actually one of the more sensical options you do have as Thorek. Because you don't really want to spend too much time over here, and Warzag has ridiculous amount of faction potential. Thanks Creative Assembly, he's pretty damn scary, and he's been scary ever since the Greenskin rework and his updated starting position. But on top of that, you don't want to spend too much time here because all of the objectives, the artifacts that Thorek is chasing after, they're all the way to the north, very far north. So there is one you get in, Karagorun, there's one you get in Lamia, Misty Mountain, Karakazgal. You can also get a confederation with Karakazul from a distance. So your objective with Thorek is to always head north, while everything goes to hell in your backside. So even if you're losing Karakazorn, that's not necessarily a big deal from your campaign objective standpoint. But it is a very questionable campaign dynamic where one of the main things that Thorek has had, which is jungle warfare, and he's really good in the jungle, is neglected because you're just basically playing another dwarf who's focused on the balance, which is already Thorgrim's shtick, really. You're just coming in from the south as opposed to coming in from the north in the way that Thorgrim does it. So that in itself is a fairly questionable strategy with regards to Thorek Ironbrow's campaign and the campaign dynamics. But wait, there's more. Beyond just having, Warzag in your backside, you also got to consider the legendary grudges of the dwarves. And each Dwarf Legendary Lord has some Legendary Grudge that they can do faster than others. So if you're playing as Thorgrim, get restoring the Underway, as well as dealing with Skarsnik, and Queek is one of your objectives in that campaign. Also for Belegar, right? Although, really, Loren's more his thing, surprisingly so, in a campaign. But the issue that Thorek has is that his Legendary Grudge requires him to deal with a lot of the factions that are here. Now, some of these are fairly sensical, Skarbrand and all that kind of stuff. But then you have Krokkar and you have Teclis. Crucially, the one faction that isn't here is the one faction that should be here, Warzag. Seriously, why is Teclis on this list? Why is Krokkar on this list? And why is Warzag not on this list? Because Creative Assembly reworked those Legendary Grudges before they changed Warzag, and they didn't update that Legendary Grudge. So his Legendary Grudge, which is not really worth it anyway, because yes, it's giving you Oath Gold, you won't struggle with that, is just outdated. And that's the running theme in a campaign as Thorek Ironbrow. And there's more. You want to head north, because if you don't head north and to deal with Queek is just going to demolish everything in his path. Queek is a very powerful lord because Frenzy on Clan Rats is no freaking joke. And then when you start talking about Plague Claws and Storm Vermin and all the insanity that Queek starts unleashing once he takes Karakate Peaks, which his AI will almost certainly do in a lot of campaigns, it becomes an even bigger problem. Queek is a lot more dangerous. In Karakazul's armies, they might hold their own, they might do a decent enough job, but they can also be defeated fairly quickly as well. And it's also pushing you in a situation where you want to confederate Karakazul as quickly as possible. But then, you may run out of money. The reason you may run out of money is you do have these settlements close to each other, but moving anywhere else is just a time-consuming effort. So you end up with two issues. One, post-battle loot. Two, and capturing settlements. So both of those are money. And then the second issue is with regards to your grudge meter, your Age of Reckoning. Now over here I was just able to complete that Age of Reckoning 100%, but that's because I got really lucky and I got Tretch in a situation with Karakazul's army and I wiped him out. If that had not happened, I would have actually failed my first Age of Reckoning. So you have that dynamic where a lot of your objectives and your victory conditions in the campaign do push you to the get north. Your short campaign victory condition requires you to reforge 5 artifacts. That is fairly substantial. For what it is worth over here, I am close to getting 3 of them done. Getting 5, it's pushing it, but only if you're really going north in a pretty hardcore way. While neglecting the south, which means neglecting Warzag, which, yes, that goes as well as you might actually anticipate in this campaign. As in, Warzag will launch a wall against your Krokar and then obliterate both of you in the process. Doesn't help that Krokar's AI over here is just chilling in Lamia while, Warzag is just busily marching to wipe him, to annihilate him and taking the Golden Tower. But there's more. You do have that Quarreler Grudge Thrower benefit. You actually have quite a few benefits, but they're not necessarily syncing very well with each other. So the Grudge Thrower, Quarreler, Bolt Thrower benefit might seem very substantial to be sure, but you don't just want to use that one pony trick. Having Sundering attacks and melee attacks for Miners and Longbeards seems great until you realize you kind of don't want to use those units. However, you do get 15% cooldown for Rune Magic. Not that you'll be swimming in Runesmiths, because while you do have a recruit rank and an upkeep benefit for them, you don't actually have increased capacity. Thorek's skill line, well, it's a weird mix of various things. So, on one hand, you get armor and armor-piercing weapon damage, so melee benefits and range benefits together. So, reload time reduction for artillery units, for basic artillery units, and quarrelers, as well as having a bunch of rune benefits, which makes sense. Like, if there is something unquestionably good about Thorek's campaign, it is all the benefits that you can get for runes, including having a passive ability as the Master Rune of Spite, Firing Temper for Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin. Though focusing your skill points on getting his runes unlocked very quickly can be a bit questionable when you have other things that you want to focus on. Things like, invoke runes of Alea for casualty replenishment, vigor loss, armor for your army through Grungni, physical resistance, leadership. I think it's actually worth saying that I've come to the conclusion Thorek is probably best used as a melee lord, in the sense that you don't necessarily want a ranged army in here, like I've built over here. Instead, you just want to get a bunch of dwarf warriors stacked up as quickly as possible, and maybe use some artillery and support roles. Like, you'll beat most other things, and rune magic will absolutely help you with that. But yes, you do get this weird mix of range and melee benefits, but then the melee benefits take a significant turn for the benefit because he gets Frenzy for his entire army. So that is pretty powerful when you consider it, but it's just a very weird and outdated design. Like, if you look at Dwarf Legendary Lords, Belegar is all about heroes and Lord rank and unit experience if we're thinking about Karakate Peak's benefits. Thorgrim is about hero capacity, empire building, scalability of economy, and taking advantage of the deeps, especially for Karazak. Ungrim is about slayers, because he can get a bunch of heroes, legendary hero, regular slayer hero, dragon slayer hero, etc. Malachi is about war machines. Grombrindle is just about, dominating the entire freaking campaign map. But you do end up having this weird mix match of various things, and you specialize in units that are just flat out not as good as the higher tier stuff. That is available pretty quickly. You don't have any real benefits for the flying units. Okay, fair enough, only Malachi has that. Well, Grumbrindle kind of does as well. And when you look at Grudge Thrower versus Cannon, yes, having the ability of shooting that Grudge Thrower faster, having more ammo, missile strength, that sounds great until you realize cannons, even though they have some issues in terms of like terrain, cannons are generally going to perform very, very well. And that's not even talking about like the kind of benefits that you get with an Iron Drake Thunderer army versus, pure Quarrelers or focusing on melee. Like, if you want a melee-focused army for dwarves, there's actually better options. And it's also the question of what role melee units have for the dwarves. Because you gotta understand, the key to winning battles is not just like defeating enemy directly through killing them, it's also breaking their morale. The way you do so is you ensure your units take as little damage as possible while inflicting severe damage. That's where Iron Drakes come in, that's where Gyrocopters come in, that's not where Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers come in, right? And that's kind of one of the principal issues. It works, but it's also genuinely the worst dwarf playstyle that you could engage in. One could argue that Slayers are not necessarily better. That's fair enough with respect to Ungrim, but the benefit that Slayers have is they're unbreakable. Sure, they will take a lot of damage, but you can recover those casualties, and they will never break. Whereas the enemy army will break. So even for a Slayer-focused army, when you're thinking about Slayers, you're relying on their speed, you're relying on the shock of their attack, just getting a bunch of damage done very quickly. Like, that's one of the things Goblin Hewers can do. Thorek is more about slow and steady, and that's a very outdated dwarf playstyle, and I just don't think it works very well right now in the context of the game. I think it would work better with a different starting position and starting dynamic and different objectives than the ones he currently has. Maybe a system of unit customization for, like, classical dwarf units, so dwarf warriors, long beards, hammers, etc. But this weird mixed match of benefits doesn't necessarily do him any favors from my view. There's some powerful stuff over here, specifically rune magic, tradable resources, that kind of stuff. But there's also a bunch of things that are fluff, like the yoked Carnosaur. Fun, I suppose, but pretty fluff. Questine signing out. Stay tuned for more.